Hello, time for another Man in Great book review. Today's book is Inferno, The World at War, 1939-1945 by Max Hastings. This book was published by Alfred A. Knopf in 2011. It's 800 pages long. This book won the Duke of Westminster Medal for Military History in 2012. Before I talk about the book, let me make a few statements about Max Hastings. Max Hastings is a British journalist and military historian. As the chief foreign correspondent for the BBC, he covered 11 different wars during his career and traveled all over the world. As a historian, he's written books about World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Falkland Islands War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Troubles, as they call them, in Northern Ireland. So he's written extensively about various military situations. This book, as the subtitle implies, is a one-volume survey of World War II. Now, when you write books like this, there's basically two approaches you can take when you're doing a broad survey of a war. You can write from above or you can write from below. When you write from above, you're concentrating on the generals, the politicians. You're writing about military strategy, the movement of large forces, the big set piece battles, the economics of the war, and so forth like that. In other words, it's kind of like macroeconomics. You're telling the big picture. And if you write from below, it's kind of like microeconomics. You're concentrating on the everyday experiences of soldiers and civilians. You're writing about what the war was like for people who actually fought it. And that's basically the approach that Hastings is taking in this book. There's a number of photographs in Inferno, but none of them are of generals or politicians. They're all about everyday soldiers and civilians. What Hastings is doing here is he's quoting at length from letters and diary entries from various people, some combat soldiers and some civilians, about what the war was like. And as the title implies, his conclusion is the war was basically 6.5 years of hell for everybody involved. In fact, the UK title of this book is All Hell Let Loose. As he points out in the introduction to Inferno, from the fall of 1939 to the summer of 1945, an average of 27,000 people died every single day. All that time period, 27,000 a day. Some were killed in combat, but the majority were civilians. Some were killed deliberately by soldiers, shot or bombed or gassed, but many died from disease and starvation. In Vietnam alone, 1 million people died from starvation during the war because the Japanese seized their rice supply, sent it to Japan. There's also mass starvation in India because food supplies from Malaysia was cut off. There was a cyclone that hit the area, and there was also a drought. And the starvation was made worse because Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, refused to send emergency aid to India. So those people who lionize Churchill as a great war hero tend to overlook the fact that he had a dark and sometimes really ruthless side to him. He could have helped the starvation in India, but he chose not to. And he's also regarded very poorly in Ireland because of some of the activities he took as early in his career in Ireland. So this book is it's an important book, but it's a really difficult book to read if you have any empathy at all for other people, because there's atrocities described on almost every page of this 800-page book. For example, in the chapter on the invasion of Poland, Hastings describes how the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, deliberately attacked Polish school buildings. And as the children ran out of the buildings to escape from the bombing, the Stuka dive bombers would dive on them and strafe them with machine guns. As he writes in here, so they were deliberately killing children. So he writes in here that the Poles realized early on in the invasion that this wasn't going to be a normal war. This was going to be a war in which the civilians themselves were targeted, in which the idea was to kill innocent people on purpose. And every side in the war did that. The Americans, of course, firebombed Japan and Germany, killing countless numbers of civilians. And so it was atrocities were committed on all sides of the war. In Russia, of course, the Soviet Union, the bloodshed was on a vast scale. It's really hard to comprehend. Something like um, 20 million, I think, Soviet citizens were killed in the war, something like 16 million in China. Just an unbelievable amount of bloodshed and death in this war. Several decades ago, the author Studs Terkel wrote a book about World War II called The Good War. And the point he was making is that most Americans felt good about the war, about fighting the war. They felt they were fighting for a worthy cause. And in one sense, the World War II was a good war because the fascists in Germany, the fascists in Italy were defeated, the Nazis in Germany were defeated, and the militarists in Japan were defeated. So the bad guys, if you want to call them, if you have two sides, obviously the fascists were, and the Germans and the Japanese were far worse than the Allies in their behavior. They lost, so that was good. But it wasn't a good war in the general sense. It was a horrible war for everyone involved. Everyone involved suffered in some way. Death, starvation, millions of the millions of people who died. There were also millions of people who were injured, millions more who were left homeless, and of course, displaced by the war. One of the great ironies of World War II is what happened with Poland. The war really began in Europe because of the German invasion of Poland. Britain and France declared war on Germany with the idea of expelling Germany from Poland and freeing the country from Nazi occupation. But of course, after the war ended, the Soviet army was in Poland and they set up a puppet communist government, and the Poles had to face they basically exchanged a totalitarian German government for a totalitarian Russian government. And it was 2 generations before Poland had a chance to be free again. And even today, Poland is kind of looking over its shoulder at the Russians because they've seen what's happened in Ukraine. So this, in a general sense, this is a very important book because it gives you really an insight into just how awful the war was for almost everybody involved. And it talks about some aspects of the war that aren't covered very much, like the war in India and China and Burma. And particularly in China, where like 16 million people died. China wasn't a major player in the war, and yet they suffered way out of proportion to the fighting that was done there because of the Japanese attacks on civilians and the stealing of their food and so forth, the deliberate killing of people. And of course, the role of disease was important too, as even in Europe, many children developed rickets. People developing tuberculosis, diseases that had been wiped out earlier, tuberculosis and typhus and so forth were spreading throughout civilian populations by the end of the war because of the lack of food, nutrition. So it's a difficult book to read, but it's an important one because it gives you a lot of insight into parts of the war that don't get covered in the broader writing from above style. He still talks about strategy in this book and so forth. One of the points he tries to make in here is that the German soldiers were excellent soldiers. They were highly motivated, very aggressive, very creative, and they were able to hold off much larger forces for far longer than anyone would believe possible. But the top level, the German general staff, were largely staffed with incompetence. And of course, Hitler was the most incompetent leader of all. They never really developed a coherent strategy. Their decisions were, they made one terrible decision after another. The whole Battle of Stalingrad wound up to be a disaster for the Germans because they refused to retreat strategically and suffered huge losses because of that. The Americans, which the Germans tended to treat as amateurish military, amateurish soldiers, they didn't take them very seriously as soldiers. The Americans, on the other hand, as Hastings writes, were highly professional. The generals in charge of the war had a strategy from the very beginning. They had careful planning. They had great infrastructure and logistics. They were able to get the weapons and the food supplies and everything to their soldiers. And they fought a war that minimized their casualties. Only about 2% of American soldiers were actually killed in combat. So there are parts of this book that are about strategy, but it's mostly kind of a ground level view of what the war was like. So if you're interested in World War II, I think this is an important book because a lot of people tend to get caught up in the strategy and the seeing of the war as a game. And they kind of forget the fact that this was a huge disaster for the war. It's like for about 6.5 years, the whole world lost its humanity and treated each other with unprecedented savagery. And you're reminded by that of that on almost every page of this book. The book is Inferno, The World at War, 1939-1945. The author is Max Hastings. This has been another Man in Great book review. Thanks for watching.